Welcome to the deep dive, where we really dig into the stories everyone's talking about. And today, we're diving deep into a case that's both true crime and, honestly, a real head-scratcher, the West Memphis Three.
Definitely a case with a lot of layers, a lot to unpack.
So we're talking about this case that captivated the whole country way back in 1993. It all starts in West Memphis, Arkansas, where three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, vanish.
And their bikes?
Yeah, their bikes were found abandoned near a place called Robin Hood Hills, which, by the way, just adds to the whole eerie feeling of it all, you know?
Right, like something out of a, well, yeah.
Exactly. And then comes the news everyone was dreading. The boys are found dead in a creek. And here's the detail that really gets you. They were hogtied.
Yeah, that detail, it sent chills down everyone's spine. It's the kind of crime that just terrifies a community, leaves everyone searching for answers.
Desperate for answers. And I think that's part of what makes this case so fascinating, so frustrating even, because there was this instant need to find someone, anyone, to blame.
Right, and that need, combined with the brutality of the crime, it created this kind of perfect storm for suspicion. And you know what happens when fear and suspicion mix like that?
It gets messy.
It gets very messy. And that's where Damien Echols enters the picture.
Right, Damien Echols, the teenager who was into the occult, wore black clothing, listened to heavy metal.
All the things that at the time were seen as,
It's vicious.
Exactly. And he quickly became the focus of the police investigation.
But was it just because of how he looked, how he dressed?
Well, there was more to it than that. There's this witness, Vicky Hutcherson, and her testimony was, let's just say, pretty interesting. She starts talking about Damien and these supposed occult gatherings, and it really caught people's attention.
It played right into their fears.
Exactly. And that put Damien Echols right in the spotlight.
It's almost like our brains are wired to look for patterns, to find someone to blame, especially in moments of tragedy. But as we know, things are rarely that simple.
Never that simple. And that's where Jessie Misskelley Jr. comes in. He confesses to being involved and implicates Damien and another teenager, Jason Baldwin.
But even then, there were problems with his confession, right?
Oh, absolutely. There were details in his story that just didn't line up with the facts.
And you have to remember, Jessie Misskelley Jr., he was a teenager with a low IQ, and he was interrogated by the police for hours. So you've got a confession, which he later takes back, obtained under those circumstances.
It definitely raises questions, big questions.
Yeah, questions about the validity of the confession, questions about the whole investigation, and those questions, they would stick around. In fact, they became even louder a few years later when the Paradise Lost documentary came out.
That documentary, it changed everything. Because it wasn't just another true crime story. It got people thinking, really thinking, about the possibility that the West Memphis Three, that maybe they were innocent.
That maybe the investigation and the trial, that maybe they were flawed.
Exactly. And it wasn't just everyday people who were captivated by this story. Celebrities, big names like Johnny Depp and Eddie Vedder, they became advocates for the West Memphis Three.
Yeah, they were all over it saying these guys were railroaded. And that's a big deal, because suddenly this small-town Arkansas case, it becomes a national conversation.
A national debate about justice, about reasonable doubt, about the very real possibility that these three guys, they were innocent all along.
So the documentary, it really shined a light on all the inconsistencies, got people asking the tough questions. But it wasn't until 2007, almost 15 years after the murders, that things really took a turn.
That's when that new DNA evidence emerged, changed the game completely.
It really did, because suddenly there was this new piece of the puzzle that just didn't fit with the original narrative.
What's so crucial about that DNA evidence is that it didn't directly incriminate anyone new, but it definitely cast a huge shadow of doubt over the involvement of Echols, Baldwin, and Misskelley. I mean, their DNA, it just wasn't there. Not on the victims, not at the crime scene.
It was nowhere to be found. And what's even more interesting, I think, is that the DNA evidence they did find pointed to a pretty unexpected person.
Terry Hobbs.
The stepfather of one of the victims. Can you imagine how that went over?
Oh, it was a total bombshell.
No.
Now, it's super important to clarify, that DNA evidence, it wasn't a perfect match to Terry Hobbs.
Right, it wasn't a smoking gun.
Exactly. But it showed that he couldn't be ruled out as contributing the DNA.
Wow.
And when you take that and combine it with the fact that there was zero DNA from the West Memphis Three, well, people started looking at Terry Hobbs differently.
It makes you wonder, what if they'd had this technology back in '93?
Right. It's like you're putting together this puzzle, you think you've almost got it, and then boom, you find this one piece that it just throws the whole picture into question. And that's kind of what that DNA evidence did.
Because now You've got to re-examine everything. And in the middle of all this, you have the West Memphis Three, still in prison, their supporters fighting tirelessly for their release. It all culminated in 2011 with those Alfred pleas.
Yeah, the Alfred pleas, those are fascinating. For anyone who isn't a legal eagle, basically, an Alfred plea lets a defendant maintain their innocence, still say, hey, I didn't do it. But at the same time, they're acknowledging that the prosecution, they might just have enough to get a conviction.
So it's a way to get out of jail without actually admitting guilt. It's a tough call, a really tough call.
It's a gamble, that's for sure. And in this case, it led to the release of the West Memphis Three after almost 20 years behind bars. But it also left this huge cloud of uncertainty hanging over everything.
Because for their supporters, for people who believe in their innocence, that Alfred plea, it felt like a hollow victory. Like, yeah, they're out of prison, but they had to plead guilty to get there.
Right, and on the other side, for people who believed in their guilt, that plea, it felt like they got away with it, like justice wasn't served.
It's such a complicated situation, and it really underscores the fact that the justice system, it doesn't always have these black and white answers. There's a lot of gray area, a lot of ambiguity. In this case, it's full of it.
And it doesn't stop there. Because even after the Alfred pleas, even after the West Memphis Three were released, the fight for answers, the search for the truth, it never really went away, did it?
Not at all. It kept going, and in 2024, it took another really significant turn. The Arkansas Supreme Court, they made a decision to allow a whole new round of DNA testing on evidence from the original crime scene. And this time, they were going to be using this cutting-edge technology, something called the MVAC system.
Yeah, that was huge. And Damien Echols himself, he was really instrumental in pushing for that new testing. He never gave up on clearing his name.
So for those of us who aren't forensic scientists, what exactly is this MVAC and what makes it so special?
Think of it like this. Imagine a super-powered vacuum cleaner for DNA. That's basically what MVAC is. It's this incredible tool because it can collect even the tiniest traces of DNA, even from really difficult surfaces like rocks, clothing, things that those cotton swabs they used to use might completely miss.
So it's incredibly sensitive.
It's like the difference between using a magnifying glass and a high-powered microscope. In a case like this, where the original investigation might have missed crucial evidence, having that level of sensitivity could be the difference between, well,
between finally getting answers and never knowing the truth.
Exactly.
So with this new technology, with the MVAC being used, where does that leave Terry Hobbs, especially considering he was linked to the crime scene by that earlier DNA testing?
Well, you can imagine he's not exactly thrilled about this whole thing.
Yeah.
In fact, he's opposed to this new round of DNA testing. And it's understandable when you think about it, right? Because if these new tests clear the West Memphis Three and point even more definitively towards him, it throws everything wide open again.
It could mean overturning a decades-old case. The stakes are incredibly high.
Incredibly high.
And that's where we find ourselves now, back in this familiar place of waiting, of wondering, will this new DNA testing give us the answers we've been searching for all these years? It's strange, isn't it? We're here, all these years later, still waiting, still hoping for answers in this case.
It's like we're right back in 1993. Only this time, we know how much is riding on the truth.
Exactly, and I think that's what makes this new development so fascinating, so frustrating even, because we're not just looking at DNA evidence in a vacuum. We're looking at it through the lens of everything that's come before. All the trials, the documentaries, the books, the public outcry. It's like this case has taken on a life of its own.
Absolutely. And that's the thing about these high-profile cases. They become so much bigger than just the facts. They tap into our deepest fears, our desires for justice, for closure.
And in this case, it's hard to imagine any outcome that will satisfy everyone.
That's the heart of it, isn't it? No matter what this new DNA testing reveals, there are going to be people who are left feeling like justice wasn't served.
Like there's still unanswered questions.
Exactly. But let's just say, for a moment, that this new testing, it gives us a definitive answer. Let's say it conclusively proves that the West Memphis Three, that they were innocent all along.
What then? What does justice even look like after all this time?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because if they were wrongfully convicted, it means that three men, they spent years, decades of their lives locked up for a crime they didn't commit.
And it means that the real perpetrator, they might still be out there.
Potentially living their life, while these three men, they had their lives stolen from them.
It's a heavy thought, and it makes you question everything, It makes you question the investigation, the trial, the whole system, and it makes you think about those three little boys, Stevie, Michael, Christopher, and their families.
You're right, because in all of this, it's easy to forget that at the center of it all, there are victims. And those victims, they deserve justice too.
They absolutely do. And it's a reminder that no matter what happens next in this case, no matter what this new evidence reveals, there are no winners here.
There's really not. There's just loss. There's heartbreak. There's this deep, unsettling feeling that the truth, even if we find it, it might not be enough.
It might not bring back what was lost.
Exactly. And I think that's an important thing to remember as we move forward with this case, as we process whatever comes next. There are no easy answers. There are no guarantees of closure.
There's just this ongoing search for the truth. A search that, in many ways, defines this case and highlights the complexities of the justice system itself.
It's messy. It's imperfect. And sometimes it takes a really, really long time to even get close to something that resembles justice.
So where do we go from here? What can we do while we wait for the results of this new DNA testing?
I think the most important thing we can do is keep talking about it. Keep asking the tough questions. Keep demanding accountability and transparency, not just in this case, but in all cases where justice seems out of reach.
Because maybe, just maybe, by continuing to shine a light on these complex cases, by refusing to let them be forgotten, we can help create a system that's a little bit closer to delivering on its promise.
A system that's a little bit closer to ensuring that everyone, regardless of who they are or what they've been accused of, that they get a fair shake.
And that's what it's all about, right? Fairness. Justice. It might not be easy, but it's always worth striving for. Well, folks, that's another deep dive wrapped up. Today, we explored the twists and turns of the West Memphis Three case, a story that's captivated the nation for decades and continues to unfold even now.
And that's what's so fascinating about these deep dives, isn't it? We get to really dig into the heart of these complex cases, to examine the evidence, the arguments, the human stories that make them so compelling.
And we do it together. Because at the deep dive, it's not just about us telling you what to think, it's about giving you the information you need, the context you need to form your own opinions.
To draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. So keep those questions coming, keep those conversations going, and we'll be back next time with another deep dive. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.